So my name is Casey Mattox. I'm VP for Legal and Judicial Strategy at Americans for Prosperity. We have Guy Benson with Town Hall, Fox News contributor. And basically what we wanted to talk about was sort of some interrelated problems that we're seeing play out. And it's this sense of outrage, this outrage culture that I think we've probably all had at least some taste of. You're blessed if you haven't. Corrupt politicians, and how both of those things end up impacting your personal privacy. So it turns out that Guy has actually written a whole book on outrage culture. So Guy, you've dove into this topic a lot. Was there a precipitating event that really kind of raised this on your in your field of vision and made you concerned about what you were seeing with sort of this culture of outrage?
Yeah, so the book that I wrote was a couple years ago now. It was called End of Discussion, and I co-wrote it with my friend Mary Catherine Ham, who is, for a long time, you might remember her from Fox News. If you can't quite picture her, she was the brunette. We all have diversity hires, and we do hire some brunettes at Fox. So she and I worked together at Fox for a while. She's now at CNN, which we call fake news. Very mean, not nice, not nice. But we would have these conversations all the time, just as friends. It's much cheaper than paying a therapist to talk about Washington and how insane things are. And this recurring theme for us was outrage culture and how it was silencing speech, and how at least trying to bully people into not stating out loud or acting in their lives in accordance with their own beliefs. And there was this event that happened in 2015 that was the catalyst for us to say, maybe we should turn these conversations that we have privately on the phone where our heads are exploding, we should maybe write a book about this. And it was, ironically, it was an incident out in California involving a gentleman named Brendan Eich. Many of you, I think, probably remember this. He was one of the founders of Mozilla, an internet company, and he was announced as the new CEO out in Silicon Valley. And it then emerged at the time that he had donated $1,000 of his private money, his personal money, to the Proposition 8 campaign in California in 2008, which was the one-man, one-woman constitutional amendment in that state, which I will also point out in 2008 won in California, right? Barack Obama was on the ballot. He won a blowout election in that state, and also traditional marriage on the ballot won that same year. So this guy had given $1,000, and that was a thought crime that they did not want to allow. So there was this ginned up mob of people at Mozilla and outside activists who basically confronted Mr. Eich, and they said, look, you have two choices. You can prostrate yourself, you can grovel, you can apologize and take back that belief and make amends somehow financially, or you're out. And he said, well, no, that's actually not how America works. I founded this company, we can disagree on things. The mob got louder and louder in Silicon Valley. One of his colleagues, to her credit, a member of the LGBT community, tried to sort of reason with the mob briefly. She's like, you guys, I have a big disagreement with Brendan on this thing. We don't agree at all. However, hey, Eric.
Hi.
However, he's been a very good leader. He's never discriminated against anyone. Shouldn't actions matter here? And they said, no, that's not good enough. And the long story short, they hounded Brendan Eich out of the company that he founded, and he's no longer there. And it was just sort of this astonishing turn of events where he held a mainstream political position, had given a little bit of his own money on behalf of a campaign that won, and it disqualified him from this job at the company that he started. And Mary Catherine and I watched all that from the other coast thinking, that is crazy. That is really frightening. And Mary Catherine and I actually disagree with Brendan Eich on the issue. She and I are both in favor of gay marriage. This is personal to me. I'm getting married next month to a dude. But I also you don't have to applaud, you can, it's fine. It's just a thing, The point is, I disagree with Brendan Eich, and yet I saw what happened to him on that issue, and I thought that is a really poisonous, frightening thing that should not happen in America. And she and I were watching an MSNBC segment where they had multiple liberals on the panel, if you can believe it. And one of the liberals, they were talking about the Brendan Eich situation at the time, and one of the liberals was a little bit more of a classical liberal, right, a little bit more old school, and he seemed a bit perturbed by this, because the tone of the segment was celebratory, right? They got the scalp, this is good, progress is on the march. And this guy was saying, wait, hang on, this is actually a little bit worrisome to me. He asked this to the panel, are you saying that we should track down anyone who donated to Proposition 8 and hound them out of polite society? And the other leftist on the panel said, yes. And he was very enthusiastic about it. Let's find that blacklist eventually, and let's go about enforcing our new orthodoxy person by person. He said this on national television. The other guy looked a little bit shocked and frightened by that answer, but I think that was a harbinger of things to come, the way the left has increasingly been operating. So that was the incident that made us write the book, and it's why, to this day, I think the problem is getting worse, and I focus on it a lot in my writing and commentary.
Yeah. Well, you know, on this, it's one of the reasons that we made a conscious decision, and I've been asked by people in the crowd, why aren't you doing your conference through a nonprofit? We've got a number of people who wanted help with the conference, and they were scared of being listed as being part of the conference because they've been harassed through giving to other groups, whether it's Christian groups or what have you. I mean, we've got the Chick-fil-A situation here in Georgia with constant harassment. It definitely is the weaponization of transparency by the left right now. I used to favor transparency. I was a lawyer. I did campaign finance. I thought it was good. I'm more and more scared of transparency because of the weaponization of it on the left. Coming in late on the Brendan Eich conversation, I remember the story of the waitress at the restaurant in California who was Mormon, who gave money to Proposition 8 and had protesters show up at the restaurant and demand that she be fired. Right. Which is you don't hear about these stories in the national media, but it happened.
Yeah, no, that's right. And look, I mean, everybody's for transparency. The question is, who needs to be transparent, right? Is it, do I have to be transparent, or does the government have to be transparent? That's the big question mark, right? And in my view, and I think this is the, most people would be here if they really think about these issues. The government is who needs to be transparent. I deserve privacy. And, so we do a lot with, trying to actually keep government transparent. We do FOIA requests. We advocate for laws that make the government have to keep their books open. That doesn't mean my books have to be open. That my personal checking account and who I support and where I have my, what I'm interested in and passionate about, that has to be, revealed for the government. So.
Well, and I think that I remember when the donor privacy issue first started getting tied into the outrage culture, I had a few people from organizations like yours come to me and say, hey, can you come, we want to brief you on donor privacy. This sounds really important to us here. And I was like, okay, that sounds very boring to me. I don't have a lot of money. I'm not really donating to stuff, but if, I'll take your word for it, right? And I'm like, but I'm also, just to warn you, I'm pro-transparency, so I'm not really sure I'll be receptive to your argument. Then they actually start laying out the argument, and more persuasive than the theoretical argument is the actual stuff that is happening constantly. It is becoming now commonplace on the left to use guerrilla tactics to try to destroy people that you don't like or that you disagree with, right? When you see my colleague at Fox News, when his house is attacked by Antifa, that is a real thing that happened. They figured out where he lived, and they laid siege to his house. They dented his front door. The wife thought it was a home invasion. Tucker's wife had to call the police. This happened. It caused a slight stir. It got some play on Fox News, and it was generally just swept under the rug. A handful of center-left people said, oh, we shouldn't do that. But you see senators like Ted Cruz getting chased out of restaurants by mobs. Sarah Sanders as well. And I think they're trying to normalize this type of activity, and it's not just against CEOs of tech companies. It's not just against Fox News hosts or White House press secretaries, right? It keeps trickling down to bakers in Colorado, right? The idea that they are not going to try to use these exact tactics and weaponize transparency in order to attack people, the whole point is not necessarily to get everyone to agree with them, it is to make people scared to publicly cross them or disagree with them. Because if they can stifle the opposition, then they've won. We can privately believe what we believe, but we're going to be very hesitant or reticent about speaking out about it. Right. As a quick aside, I think they're making tactically some mistakes because most Americans don't like mob rule. And also when you force people into silence and then all of a sudden they're in a voting booth by themselves, that is how literally we got Donald Trump, literally, right? Because during the 2016 election, Erick, I think you had some controversial opinions about the president.
At this event, I think.
I think we all did, actually, right? I was not a Trump supporter at all. I was very public about that. And I went around the country covering the race, talking to conservatives, being like, why? This is during the primary. Why are we doing this? Like, you know he's not actually a conservative. And they're like, yeah, but we'll see. And I'm like, you know he's not really a good person, right? They're like, well, he's not perfect. I'm like, okay, that's a fair way of putting it. That is true. We're not electing a pastor and all that. Like, so why are we doing this? And the answer consistently, over and over again, was they have been bullying us forever, telling us that we are horrible people. Our people always play nice. Sometimes they lose. And we're going to hire our own bully. And he's going to go and throw roundhouses. And that's exactly what he's done. I think that's why we saw some of the polling gaps in certain states. But the goal, increasingly, is to make it only, like you can whisper about your beliefs in your house, you can maybe talk about it at church, you can do it in the voting booth, but if you want to be involved in commerce, you better toe the line or we're going to come after you. And that's why I started coming around on this donor privacy stuff, because they proved that the conspiracy theory is not a conspiracy, because they're doing it, and it's getting, I think, more acute.
And in some cases, I mean, it's, there's refreshing honesty, right? I mean,
it's nice to know they actually do hate us.
Right. Yeah. Well, I mean,
we just thought it.
Some of these things we've seen. I mean, even Governor Bullock from Montana just the other day in the debates proclaims that he has put in this new measure that will drive his political opponents out of Montana.
Is there like a perimeter defense around Montana now that if Coke gets closed,
I think
the shields go up? And
apparently they're
building a wall.
Yeah, they're building a wall around Montana.
A wall around Montana. Yeah. Only keeps out Cokes.
Yeah, so that's. But like, how troubling is that, right? The idea that a politician would think that it's a great applause line to say that I have used the tools of government to go after my political opponents, and that's just, this is great, and everyone applauds, right? Like that's exactly the kind of thing we're talking about.
But the thing that really frustrates me in the political conversation of the day, particularly on the left, is how Donald Trump is this deeply divisive person, and he's dividing us up, and I'm like, he's not the one who said take a gun to a knife fight or told Hispanic voters Republicans were their enemies, or actively encouraged people to report their neighbor if they lied about Obamacare. And we've seen the left amplify this now to the degree of the harassment of individuals, getting them out of corporations. And you also see corporate America frequently involved in this as well now, because they are either afraid of or allied with the left on these issues. But what I think is so interesting is when you look at the state level, and forgive me if this is something you raised earlier, but when you look at some of the donor transparency laws that are at the state level, you have left-wing groups that are just as opposed to them as conservative groups.
You do, and you have, basically this, particularly at the state level, this is not a problem of the left going after the right. That we talk about tribalism a lot, right? Well, you've got the sort of left-wing tribe, and you've got the right-wing tribe. You also have the politician tribe, and their interest is staying in power. And oftentimes that means quieting the voice of the people like the folks in this room who would hold them accountable, right? So people on the right, Republican politicians, who are upset that people like you are actually going to expect them to do the things that they said they were going to do. And so it's very often the case that those are the people who are advocating for, basically wanting to expose all these folks so they can know who are going after them. You've actually had a story on this front in Georgia, I think.
Yeah,
we
had for those of you who are out of the state, the Speaker of the House here in Georgia has for years now tried to push a law that if you, private citizen, show up at the state legislature to lobby the legislature as a private citizen on a piece of legislation, that you have to disclose your finances and report yourself as a lobbyist, even though you're a private citizen talking to your legislator. That law exploded in what he wanted to do to try to get conservative groups to have to disclose who is funding the conservative groups. This is a Republican speaker trying to get conservative donors and conservative groups and conservative private citizens to have to do filings with the state if they wanted to petition the state government. And thankfully the legislation has died every year, but every legislative cycle it's come up, it's still an active piece of legislation for this coming January's General Assembly.
Yeah, but in terms of some of these other state bills, right, you've had, just to give you a picture of what you're looking at as potential problems. This is a constant fight on the federal level. Arizona, for example. Arizona had a ballot initiative that missed by just a few thousand votes, a few thousand signatures going onto the ballot. That would have required original source disclosure. Now what that means is, I'll break it down simply. Say the Family Policy Council in Arizona supports a ballot initiative on religious freedom, right? Spend $25,000 on a ballot initiative on religious freedom. Your church, you go to Scottsdale Baptist Church, and Scottsdale Baptist Church has given money to the Family Policy Council. Not only is there a government website created that lists Scottsdale Baptist Church as a contributor to the Family Policy Council that had advocated on the Religious Freedom Ballot Initiative, everyone who gives money to Scottsdale Baptist Church is disclosed on the government website and how much you gave, right? So your tithe history, if you are a member of Scottsdale Baptist Church. So not only is that just sort of on its face something that should scare people, and frankly, it would be much easier if you're a pastor to know if you're actually tithing or not, which may be a whole other problem for people. But it's also like, look, I'm being tabbed as someone who contributed on this particular ballot initiative. I didn't even know that happened. I didn't know my church gave money to the Family Policy Council. You may not even support the thing, right? You just tithe to your church, and the next thing you know, you're being publicly criticized as someone who is supporting this particular political end. So it really gets kind of crazy. Some of these state laws that have been proposed, retroactive donor disclosure has been proposed, where you gave money to someone knowing that you were protected, not going to be disclosed, and the legislature comes along a couple of years later and says, let's go back and disclose all those people and force them out. So.
And I think weaponizing is like really the key word here. Because if you then have all these lists of donors, that becomes potentially an ideological hit list for the organized left in particular to come after people, right? So we all remember the IRS targeting scandal under the scandal-free Obama administration, as we are repeatedly assured. There was only like that small, among others, that thing about the government going after their political enemies through the tax code that they admitted to and apologized and ended up paying damages, right? There was a settlement there. That was illegal, what the government did. There was another instance also involving the marriage issue where a donor list was illegally leaked to a pro-gay marriage group by someone at the IRS. That was a crime, right? And that had to be adjudicated. What this would do is basically...
But just clarify, it was scandal-free.
Right, yes.
Yeah, scandal-free.
We all agree. We all agree. And someone who vigorously agreed with that was Gayle King, the CBS News anchor who interviewed Michelle Obama, who made the point about no scandals, and Gayle King was like, absolutely. And people were like, Gayle King, you went on vacation with the Obamas. She was like, yeah, that's irrelevant. That has nothing to do with the way I do my
She's
job.
Oprah's best friend. She's allowed to do whatever she wants.
Yeah, no, basically yes.
Yeah.
But the point is, we saw these instances where the law was broken to target conservatives. This would enshrine in law, in some ways, the publication, literally, to the entire country of these lists. And it wouldn't necessarily even have to be the government who would do it. You just hand these lists off to these left-wing organizations. They're like, okay, where are the pressure points? Where can we come after certain people? And to Erick's, you touched on this briefly. I think this is really, really important. I think on the right, we are pro-business, right? We're capitalists. We are generally the side that will have corporate America's back in some of these fights. The hard left wants to destroy these companies, right? They view them as a terrible thing. Corporate America increasingly, I think, is terrified of the left, constantly trying to genuflect and at least postpone the reckoning. And so they're constantly signaling and bowing on these particularly social issues to the left. And I think that would be exploited, right? I think if the people who have donated to certain causes can be identified, there will be left-wing organizations that already exist or that would sprout up that would try to pressure employers. Why did you hire that person? Why is this person who donated to these hateful causes, why does this person have a job at your company? Do you hate these groups of people? Right? That is how they've operated for years. This would give them every pressure point they would need, and it would drive people, someone who's cautious, someone who doesn't want to get mixed up in it, they might believe things but they don't want their name attached to it, someone who just wants to live their life, they're going to start making the calculation, I'm not going to do this anymore. I'm going to extricate myself from the political process or from the ideas game because I just want to live my life and do my job, and I don't want these howling mobs, virtual or otherwise, showing up at my doorstep. And I think that's ultimately the goal here. It's an intimidation tactic dressed up in the very popular concept of transparency.
Right. You know, I think what bothers me as a free speech advocate on this, I think, too, is this notion that unless I know who has paid money to promote an idea, I can't know whether the idea is a good one or not. Like, that's crazy. That's not how this works, right? If someone is saying, I think the tax rate, your tax, you should be taxed at 20%, and someone is saying you should be taxed at 15%, let's just have a conversation about who's right there, right? If you're proposing that we should have this new federal program, let's talk about what that federal program is and whether it makes sense. But the idea that you can't know whether something is a good idea until you know everyone who puts money behind that thing and supports that idea. It's the exact same tribalism, I think, that's sort of crippling us, where the mentality is almost like, in order to know whether your idea is good, I have to know who would benefit from this, because it's more important to know if someone I don't like is going to benefit from this idea than whether or not the idea is actually a good one.
I'm afraid we're going to see an organized effort. One of the things that, with the tribalism we have right now, is this left-right dynamic where, because of the left's behavior, there are people on the right who say, hey, we should behave like them. And I think it's a very dangerous thing for the right to go down and say, hey, we should be targeting donors to left-wing causes. Because one of the reasons that the left is effective in this oftentimes is because they have corporate alliances with them. I mean, we saw this when Georgia
and the
passed
media.
fetal heartbeat.
Yeah, and the media,
yeah,
right?
And the media.
So like their mobs are more powerful than our mobs because they've got the cultural tastemakers almost uniformly behind them.
And if we go down this road and we decide to weaponize this, I mean, like the Speaker of the House here in Georgia wanting to do, but he wants to go after conservatives, it becomes a very dangerous game that I don't think conservatives can win. It's also something where I think when you get to the local level, you do have, for example, Planned Parenthood in New Jersey was very much opposed to New Jersey doing donor disclosure rules. Planned Parenthood nationally was okay, but I mean, you can't imagine certain businesses supporting abortion rights. The pro-life community is about the most effective group on the right when it comes to mobilizing public sentiment. The tribalism of this country, if the right goes down this road and we're seeing bits and pieces of people on the right thinking it becomes dangerous.
Well, yes, I think it's also, we shouldn't emulate their worst impulses. I think it's, soul crushing for the country. And I feel like even on a more fundamental level or a heart level, right? I don't think we need to give more tools, just put them into the ether for people to weaponize their political rage even more than is already the case. Like politics has already taken over and seeped into every aspect of American society. Like I'm a huge sports fan. And it drives me crazy the extent to which the sports media is now trying to do their preening woke thing too. I'm like, just leave me alone and let me watch football, please. And I think a lot of Americans are exhausted by the politicizing of everything. This is that on steroids.
Well, it's a modern innovation that the Obama campaign did in 2012, if people recall, developed a campaign app that you could put on your phone and see who all the Democrat and Republican neighbors were in your neighborhood and whether or not they had voted. The Obama administration began to do that. There are these incremental steps along
There's an
the way.
app also, this is true, we wrote about this in our book, where you can go to the grocery store, for example, and like scan a barcode, and it will show you the political donations of the parent company that like made the cereal or whatever. I'm like, you need help if you have this app and you're going to the grocery store and adding an extra hour because you're like, oh my gosh, this company has 45% Republican donations, but this cereal, which I like less and is less delicious, but they have fewer Republican donations, maybe I'll go with that.
Right.
There's something like
I
deeply
thought people on the left
disturbed.
only ate granola anyway.
Well, and the other thing is there are certain limits to this.
Yeah.
And one of the limits to this, and I think the American people have made this very clear, I work a lot of the time in New York City. There is a line around the block constantly at the Chick-fil-A right by my office.
And there are Chick-fil-A's all up 7th Avenue now.
Yeah, they're everywhere. So like when they came, the New York City Council, all these people were like, we will not have hate in our city. And then New Yorkers are like, that chicken's really good. And so like, I feel like we can all just chill the hell out and eat really good chicken and not focus on politics constantly. And that would get outside of like hardcore progressive activist circles where this is their lifeblood, this is their tactical wheelhouse, where they need this, they need the hyper politicization of everything. Outside of those precincts, I think center left, center, and right, what I just said would get applause. And I feel like that's kind of the coalition that we need to hang on to in this country, of people who don't want politics dominating every corner. And that's where I think we can appeal not only to the privacy stuff that we've been talking about, but also we don't need more politics in our country. That's where I think we can persuade people, particularly on these otherwise kind of arcane sounding issues.
Yeah. No, and and kind of on the flip side of this, right? Like, I mean, the argument from the other side is that we need to get money out of politics, by which they don't mean necessarily to the politicians themselves. They're very happy to have the money coming to the politicians themselves. What they actually mean is, themselves. What they actually mean is, we need to have everybody else stop talking about this stuff so that we can just sort of run your lives, right? You're kind of complicating things, with the rabble trying to get involved here. Look, if you want money out of political life, then you need to get politicians out of our lives, right? If you do that, if politics is much less present in my life, there's a whole lot less of a reason for people to want to spend their money to influence what politicians are going to do.
Well, one of the downsides on this, I think, is that as the country becomes increasingly secular, politics becomes the religion. Yeah. And the way people respond to this, I mean, taking the app to the grocery store to find out the food is almost a religious rite of passage for people, support of Planned Parenthood. How we de-escalate this.
We do it too, though, don't we, on our side, right? Like absolutely. The Flight 93 election, like, if we don't win this next election, the country will be gone.
Yeah,
and so
every single election is like that. I heard Joe Biden the other day, this is the most consequential election of our lifetime. That's what they said when Barack Obama was against John McCain. How is this one more consequential than that one?
It was Bush Gore.
Right-wing scary man, John McCain,
yes,
might come in and ruin the country.
Right.
And that's when they cry wolf enough. Then, like, all of a sudden, the wolf shows up. He's like, hello, everyone. I finally made it. And then they've used every term, every word, every fear tactic in the book against, like, Mitt Romney, right?
Yeah,
history's greatest monster, Mitt Romney. And, like, there's a horrible man who wants to strangle Big Bird to death and all the things that they said about him. And that's, to my point earlier, a lot of voters are like, enough of this. Let's get the person who kind of is the stereotype and punish them, and then that's what they've gotten. So it's like, congrats.
This was a Bill Maher monologue, seriously, in 2016, that, I'm sorry we said such bad things about George Bush and John McCain and Mitt Romney. This time we're serious. We really do mean it.
No, in 20 years, they're going to be on MSNBC, if it still exists. They're going to be like, we really pine for the days of the Trump administration where we had a sober and rational Republican president, unlike the newest crazy wild-eyed threat to everything. It's the same playbook over and over again.
Yeah, very much so. Right. Well, listen, I guess how much time do we have? We're running long, but this is
Can I make one more short point?
Yes,
very
please.
short point about how this is my worry, and you were talking about corporations and how they kind of are on board, unfortunately, out of fear, I think. You guys know this in Georgia, right? You guys pass a law in Georgia, and corporate America's like, well, we don't care what conservatives think, half the country on the pro-life issue. We need to signal to these people who want to destroy us on multiple levels. If that trickles down then to employees, if there are these hit lists, that is a real thing. That will cost people their livelihoods or drive people out of the ideas space. And the fact that the media, I think, is increasingly playing footsie with this stuff, I'll leave you with this. It really disturbed me a few weeks ago at this point. The Washington Post published an op-ed from someone who was advocating, it was the Times, who was advocating doxing Border Patrol agents. Okay, so we're having this fight at the border. There's this crisis. You have progressive people who are very compassionate trying to boycott companies that are giving mattresses to the children. This is a thing. Let's boycott. Let's make these kids sleep on the floor to own the cons or something. It makes it kind of, this is so terrible what's happening with the Trump administration. We can't let them bring in beds for the children. There were a local effort to try to boycott the food services. They were feeding the people at these detention centers. In any case, the New York Times published this op-ed where this woman who's a professor somewhere arguing, we can find out who these Border Patrol agents are. We can find out where they live. We can find out where they go to church. And I'm not advocating violence, but I am saying we need to get in their faces, basically, and shame them, and that's how we can change policy. This got past editors. This was published in a prestige newspaper in America, straight up saying, let us find people doing their jobs and make their lives miserable until they bend to our will politically. Even if that means breaking the law, that's what we're going to do. And if that is the mentality that's passing muster on some level in the respectable left, if we decide that we're going to give them a roadmap of where every right-leaning or religious donor lives in America, who they work for, who they hang out with, it is not a leap to imagine what they might do to exploit that information. And to me, I'm like, they can never get that information. Right. Because then it gets all of our problems that we've been talking about on stage, I think they just proliferate, and it gets more frightening.
Guy Benson, Casey Mattox, thank you very much.
Thanks, you guys.